Perceptions and Culture: What Are You Judging Wrongfully? By Julie Gonzalez. We have heard it said, "Do not judge, lest ye also be judged." Matthew 7:1. Even the most aware, non-biased, and socially accepting people make snap judgments when they meet someone new. We're all guilty of it, and it's not necessarily our fault either. It's as if an uncontrollable mechanism goes off in our brains and reaches a conclusion before we even have time to cognitively process the information or person at hand. What's more, these perceptions are usually quite accurate, and we are unlikely to give up these first perceptions easily once they've been made. Perception is always happening. Even when you nod off to sleep, you may be wondering, why did that person look at me that way today? Did I make a funny face? As humans, we all infer and process incoming information at a rapid rate. Information regarding other humans is no exception to this rule. As you can see in the image, a lot goes into what we perceive, including what our perceptions are about ourselves. We observe people's facial expressions, body language, social habits, etc. We may even project our own insecurities and expectations onto unaware bystanders from time to time. After all, we're not perfect. According to Sabates 2012, these evaluative processes often happen automatically, intuitively, and outside our conscious awareness. Beyond simply observing what and who is happening around us, we go to great lengths to protect ourselves. Regardless of your worldview, risk analysis of our surroundings, to include people, is programmed into our instinctive responses. Our ability to correctly understand our social world is essential not only to our survival, but also our quality of life. You better take notice of that guy walking to the bank with a ski mask on. Fight or flight mode engaged. Intuitively, we all want to protect ourselves against potential threats, even if they are not this extreme or obvious. So why are we talking about this, and why is it relevant? These are merely the building blocks of understanding the much larger context of social perception and social cognition. To understand social cognition, you need to understand where it comes from and how it is formed. We have touched on some of the aspects which influence our perceptions, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list. While social perception is how we perceive and understand others, social cognition is how we use cognitive strategies to process and apply this social information. So what about my online profile? How does that come into play? I'm glad you asked. With more and more social interactions taking place online, it's become increasingly more important to address how these connections remain constructive and productive. How do we form accurate perceptions of people if there are no said social cues to pick up on? How do we know if someone is friendly or a threat? Further, how do we form accurate perceptions of the many culturally diverse people we will undoubtedly interact with? Rest assured, God has equipped us humans with the ability to properly perceive other humans most of the time, even if it is a web-based context. Research suggests that though there are many qualitative differences between real-life social interactions and online interactions, it appears that both real-world and online perceivers use some of the same strategies when making first impressions. It's not a perfect science, but at least we have something to work from. So if culture attributes to our real-life perceptions, it must also attribute to our online perceptions, right? Cultural influences just about everything and tints the lens which we tend to view things through. As you can see, I've thrown up some pictures that suggest what Eastern and Western cultures might represent. Now, some people may associate America more with McDonald's and apple pie at this point, but you get the idea. The perception one forms is not simply, all Americans like McDonald's, though is it? Could another possible example be that all or most Americans are busy and work-driven, therefore do not take the time to stop and prepare a meal or value the time to share it with another person? Further, if this is the perception, would that carry over into what attributes or preconceived notions you had on an American associate you had not yet met? And further still, would this carry over into your perception of them if you had only web-based contact with them? I've selected a very generic stereotype here for the sake of making a point. And as you can see, our own culture, as well as how we view other cultures, clearly affects our perceptions. Julian Burrell says, "We all see the world through cultural glasses." He gives us many examples of just how our culture drives our behaviors, like Norwegians do not talk to each other, or having a neutral face in Spain would signal disinterest. He says the lens through which your brain sees the world shapes your reality. There's no getting around it. So he gives us our options. He says we can confront, complain, or conform to the various cultural norms we are presented with. Show up to a new country and tell everyone, hey, I'm right and you're wrong. Or despise the new country you're in and complain about the differences. Or embrace it and learn to adapt your behaviors and attitudes to theirs. I would suggest either adapting to the new culture or planning on staying put. Otherwise, you're looking at being very unhappy in your new surroundings. In continuation of this discussion, I've done my own research on a country I would personally like to visit, Israel. While each country is undeniably unique, Israel and the United States are also similar in many ways. After studying both countries, I've listed some similarities that stood out to me. It's rather obvious that America is multicultural, but rather surprising that Israel also has a very diverse population. Both countries are considered to be part of Western civilization, which includes a capitalistic economy. Both countries are founded on biblical teachings. Israel is a nation set apart and predestined by God. America has biblical foundations woven throughout the fabric of our Constitution and government. And finally, both countries fought for their freedom. It should come as no surprise that there are a multitude of differences between the U.S. and Israel. Here are a couple that stood out to me. First, it is rude to give anything but money to a newlywed couple in Israel. Second, service in the army is mandatory for both men and women at the age of 18. Third, the Sabbath is always honored in Israel. From sundown Friday until sundown Saturday, everything is closed down. Israel is much less formal compared to America. And finally, Israelis are open books. They say how it is, and no topic is off limits, including money, which typically makes Americans rather uncomfortable to talk about. I expected to discover various cultural differences, but a couple were truly shocking. First, I didn't realize Waze, the navigation app, was developed in Israel. So cool. It's also interesting that they would create this app despite their spectacular navigation skills. I've dreamed of going to Israel for most of my life, but I would never have guessed that Israelis are often seen as rude, impolite, and inconsiderate, especially after reading how hospitable they are. Next, everything is negotiable in Israel, even your phone bill. This is surprising because both the US and Israel operate in a capitalistic state, and I could not imagine negotiating my phone bill down in the United States. Many people still depend on fax machines for communication, despite being one of the most high-tech countries in the world. And finally, not only does Israel provide good health care, they fund infertility treatments and IVF. Although I have learned some interesting things about Israel's culture, my perception of the country has not really changed. I expected that their culture would be rich with ancient traditions and histories, which carries into their day-to-day operations. It's still on my bucket list as one of my top places to travel. Thanks for tuning in.